Hello, welcome to Tarot Fascination. I'm Sophia. Tarot Fascination was born out of my interest in, my curiosity about, and my utter fascination with tarot cards. Relatively speaking, I'm a newcomer to the world of tarot. After quite a few false starts over the years where I started to try to work with tarot but then quickly gave up, about 1 year ago, I finally really got focused and started studying and learning about tarot and working with the cards. I feel like I've learned a lot in this last year, and I'd like to share some of the knowledge that I've gained with other people who are relatively new to tarot. Through the Tarot Fascination video presentations, I hope that you can learn a little bit of what I've learned as well, and that it will help you on your journey. Let's get started. In this video presentation, I'd like to talk about choosing a tarot deck. Again, this is mostly directed towards people who are fairly new to tarot. I'd like to talk about a variety of topics, starting out with some of my false starts in trying to work with tarot. And these false starts were caused largely by trying to work with a deck that I didn't understand or that was a little bit too difficult for a newcomer like myself. I want to then go into what I've identified as features of a good learning deck. I want to talk about the Rider-Waite-Smith deck in particular. I'm going to then look at the Major Arcana, the first 22 cards across 6 different decks, and to give you kind of a view of how the cards vary across decks and how this might affect your choice in a learning deck. And then finally, I'd like to make some recommendations about what I think would be a very good deck or type of decks to start learning with. Let me begin with telling you about one of my false starts in about 2002. I wanted to start learning about tarot, and one of the decks I bought was the Wheel of Change Tarot by Alexander Ganetti. It's a gorgeous deck that I still like very much. It has highly engaging images, as you can see from this example here. It draws on the mythology from many different cultures, which make it's a very culturally diverse deck. The symbolism in it is very complex, partly because it's drawing on a lot of different traditions. And the images that are used in this deck are quite different from traditional tarot images. Fortunately, it has a very detailed 383-page guidebook that is very well written. It's a unique deck, and it's very different from the descriptions in other general tarot guidebooks. So it's very hard to use with any other general tarot description. You basically can only use the companion book that comes with the deck. The problem is, it was too complex for me as a beginner. I gave up tarot for the next 14 years and thought, I can't do this. This is too hard. But again, in 2016, something about tarot lured me back, and I thought, okay, I want to work with these cards. I want to learn a little bit more about them, and I want to move ahead. So I got a new deck, and the new deck I got was the Osho Zen Tarot, which again is a beautiful deck, and you can see the images are really engaging. It draws on Zen philosophy and the teachings of Osho. And again, the symbolism is very complex. Again, they have very different images than the traditional tarot cards. It also came with a companion book, again, that was quite detailed and very interesting. It's a unique deck, and again, it was very different from the general decks that were discussed in some of the traditional guidebooks. And I had the same problem once again. It was too complex for me as a beginner, and I gave up on tarot for 4 more years. So Obviously, I chose two decks that maybe were not so good for a beginner. After I have started learning again, I found some decks that were good for me as a beginner, and it really helped me on my journey and has helped me continue this time. So how do I choose a good tarot deck to start out with if I'm new to all of this? Well, let me tell you some of the things that I think will help. I believe these are some of the features of a good tarot deck for learning. It should have 78 cards. 78 cards is really traditional for tarot. And this is 22 cards from 0, the Fool, through 21, the World or the Universe, that are called the Major Arcana, and 56 minors. And these will be basically in 4 suits, and they will have basically 14 cards in each suit, 1 through 10, and then 4 court cards. If your deck has a much different number of cards, it probably means it's not really a tarot deck. It may be an oracle deck, which can also be very interesting, but you'll have a hard time learning tarot principles if you're working with an oracle deck. So a good learning deck should also have 4 suits, and traditionally these were the suits of wands, cups, swords, and pentacles. Now they may be called fire, water, air, and earth, but you'll probably want something very similar. Now there may be some variation in the terms for wands. Wands are sometimes called staves or rods. Cups are occasionally called chalices. Pentacles are occasionally called discs or coins, but if the deck changes these words a great deal, it makes it harder to learn. The reason that working with a deck with these traditional suit names is helpful is that if you buy a general tarot handbook or learning guide, the images are going to be more consistent with the explanations in these wide range of tarot guidebooks, which is really helpful. There are some decks that require a great deal of knowledge of other esoteric systems, for example, astrology, numerology, and Kabbalah, and other systems. So it's a lot easier if you choose a deck that doesn't demand that you already have a great deal of knowledge about those things. Even a very basic learning deck may have some connections to astrology and numerology and Kabbalah possibly, but if the deck absolutely demands that you already have a great deal of knowledge, it'll make it much harder to learn. And similarly, some decks are very, very seated in a specific cultural tradition. For example, Egyptian mythology or Greek mythology or Celtic or Norse or some other pantheon. And it's easier to work with a deck that's not very specific because, again, they may demand a lot of background knowledge that you may or may not have. However, having said all of that, you do want to choose a deck that has images that fascinate you, that excite you, that inspire your imagination and your interests so that you'll want to explore more. So remember, a deck can be beautiful, but not necessarily good for beginners. And those decks might be really great to work with later, but you probably want to choose a beginner deck that meets these criteria. I would recommend a Rider-Waite-Smith deck or a deck which is closely similar to the Rider-Waite-Smith. It's a great place to start. So many of you are probably familiar with the Rider-Waite-Smith tarot, but I'd like to just kind of mention a few things about it for those of you who might not be so familiar. It was first published in 1909, and why it usually starts out with the name Rider is because that was the name of the publisher. The publisher was William Rider and Son when it was first published in 1909. It was created by Arthur Edward Waite and Pamela Coleman Smith. And Waite imagined and described and guided kind of the process of the creation of the cards. But Pamela Colman Smith was the artist who illustrated all 78 of the cards. Both Waite and Smith were members of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and this background in this occult tradition influenced both the ideas and the symbolism of the cards. Much of the Rider-Waite-Smith Major Arcana, the first 22 cards, is very similar to decks which were widespread much earlier. So from the creation of the Visconti Sforza deck probably happened in northern Italy sometime between 1420 and 1440. And those cards and the tradition of some of the images were replicated not only in hand-drawn cards, but also later, 100 years or more later, in publishing, for example, in the Tarot de Marseille, which was printed in France about 100 years after that. And then the tradition had continued. So the Major Arcana cards had a long history, and a lot of the images were basically the basis of what went on to the Rider-Waite-Smith tarot. But there were changes and additions of images based on the creator's association with the Golden Dawn. The minor arcana were a little bit of a departure from what the older tarot decks, like the Tarot de Marseille or the Visconti Sforza, because in the older decks, the suit cards often only had pictures. For example, a 4 of swords might show 4 swords, or a 9 of cups might just show 9 images of cups. However, on the Rider-Waite-Smith tarot, Pamela Colman Smith's drawings actually depicted figures doing things. And so there's kind of a little story in each one of the minor arcana, the 56 cards as well. This has become a hugely popular deck in the years since 1909, 1910, when it was first printed. It's estimated now that there are over 100 million copies of the Rider-Waite-Smith deck published, and it's been published in more than 20 different countries. Most decks now are largely indebted to the Rider-Waite-Smith. Now, another deck, the Thoth deck, was also created by members of the Golden Dawn, and there are some other ones, and some decks are more related to the Thoth deck or the much older Tarot de Marseille, but many guidebooks, I would say a vast majority of the guidebooks actually deal with the Rider-Waite-Smith deck. So for that reason, it's a very good deck to start to learn with. So why the Rider-Waite-Smith? Well, the characters and images in the major arcana are largely archetypes, and they're clearly represented in the Rider-Waite-Smith cards, and they're easy to grasp. Maybe not easy to grasp necessarily, but if you find out and learn a little bit about the archetypes as they are represented in the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, it's much easier to read other decks that depart a bit. The cards connect with each other in a variety of ways. So over the sequence of 22 cards, there are a lot of connections, card to card, moving through a progression. And each card is filled with many meaningful symbols. So when you look at them, if you can break down a little bit of what the symbolism of different things you're looking at, it can help you deepen your understanding of each card. Some of the symbols are connected to astrology, numerology, and other systems, but you can understand more about these cards without having a deep knowledge in those different areas. Now, if you are knowledgeable in those other areas, or if you become more knowledgeable, it will just add to your understanding of the cards. Most general tarot guidebooks work with the Rider-Waite-Smith deck or the Thoth or the Marseille, but working with this deck makes it so much easier to access information in different guidebooks and expand your knowledge. Decks with greatly different images on a given card usually have some conceptual connection to the Rider-Waite-Smith card, but it may not be apparent unless you know the Rider-Waite-Smith. So let me go back to the example of my false starts. Let me take the deck, the Osho Zen Tarot, for example. I originally thought that it had no relationship at all to the Rider-Waite-Smith, but when I started studying the Rider-Waite-Smith a lot more, I went back to my Osho Zen deck and I was surprised, and I realized, wow, even if the image is really, really different, actually some of the background concepts are identical to the Rider-Waite-Smith or really indebted to it. So understanding the Rider-Waite-Smith may help you understand more complex decks that depart from it quite a bit. So learning about the symbolism in this deck makes other decks more accessible. Now, in the next part of this presentation, I'd like to look at 6 different decks, and I want to look briefly at 22 cards in each one of them, because I think this will give you a clearer idea not only what the Major Arcana looks like in the Rider-Waite-Smith and similar decks, but also how it can diverge. I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail about the first 2 cards or so, and then I'm going to just kind of do a quick visual run through the other cards in the Major Arcana, just so that you can visually see where some of the departures are. I'm going to look at the Rider-Waite-Smith deck and a clone deck. I'm going to look at decks that are closely similar to the Rider-Waite-Smith, and I'm going to look at some decks that are significantly different from the Rider-Waite-Smith. So for the Rider-Waite-Smith, I'm going to use a fairly traditional version and what's called the clone deck, which has basically the same images but recolored. We're going to look at the Radiant Rider-Waite-Smith. For the decks that are closely similar to the Rider-Waite-Smith, these will be on a light blue background here to help you recognize the slides. I'm going to work with one of my favorite decks, the Llewellyn Classic. This was my own personal learning deck, and the Hanson-Roberts, which is also a good learning deck. And these two are very similar in images to the Rider-Waite-Smith. I'd like to present 2 other decks that are significantly different from the Rider-Waite-Smiths. I'm going to put these decks on kind of a light purple, pinkish purple background so that you'll know that's what you're looking at. The decks I'm looking at are the Gaian deck and the Chrysalis Tarot. Let's jump right into the first card, the Fool. These are the representations of the Rider-Waite-Smiths and the Radiant Rider-Waite-Smith. And you can tell, remember that the Rider-Waite-Smith was printed in 1909. And because of limitations in colors and printing limitations, it really affected the design. Now, fast forward more than 100 years, we can do a lot of different things in printing, and we can do more sophisticated things with colors. So what you'll see in the Radiant Rider-Waite-Smith is that it has been repainted, recolored, and contour and shape is more reliant on different colors, whereas in the Rider-Waite-Smith, shading and contour is often done with a lot of fine lines. Now, I find when I'm looking at the Rider-Waite-Smith, sometimes I'm missing detail because of those lines. And I find with the Rider-Waite-Smith, a lot of times I can actually catch the image more clearly. And I find the color a little bit more appealing, but essentially they're identical decks. Now, Let me point out a couple of things that are going to be different in the other decks. There's a lot of symbolism contained in each one of these cards. And for example, the symbol of the white rose or the red feather that the fool is wearing, or the fact that he is standing on the edge of a cliff and he's looking up and he looks like he may be about to step off. The dog is symbolic. The mountain range behind him, the sun, the staff he's carrying. In different interpretations and different guidebooks, a lot of these things are very symbolic. If you'll look at here on the light blue background, some decks that are very closely similar to the Rider-Waite-Smith, you'll see that the images and the symbols are largely retained. The colors may be different. The drawing is actually different, but in general, these types of decks will keep the key symbolism and generally the key look. However, you'll notice that sometimes things are missing. For example, the Hanson-Roberts, because it's more of a close-up, you're missing the red feather and you're missing the dog. Now, on the light purple background, we're looking at decks that are significant departures from the imagery. So in both of those, you don't have a young fool who's about to step off a cliff with the dog at his side. You have something quite different. Here in the Gaian deck, they've renamed it. Zero is not the fool, it's the seeker. The seeker is a young woman. She's not standing on a mountaintop. She's standing looking towards the mountain. She's facing away from us. She looks like she has a staff and she's getting ready to walk. There is no red feather. There is no white rose. Instead, you've got some different images. You have, for example, the butterfly, you have some swallows, and instead of a dog, you have a fox here. So the images are quite different, although some of the concept is the same. In the Chrysalis deck, for example, this is totally renamed. Zero is the hero, and they've identified this card as Merlin. Merlin has a cat, and there are a lot of different associations. Let me move on to the Magician. The Magician, again, is repeating a lot of important symbolism here. You have red roses, you have white lilies, you have a pentacle, a cup, a sword, and a wand, which are the typical suits in the Minor Arcana. You have a magician with his right hand pointing up, holding a wand. You have his left hand pointing down towards the earth. You have an infinity symbol over his head, and you have a very, very specific image for his belt. And you can see these perhaps even better, but identical symbols in the Radiant Rider-Waite-Smith. Now, when we look at a similar decks, which are on the light blue background here, the Llewellyn Classic is redrawn and it does look different. However, the magician's posture is largely the same, with his right hand up holding a wand, his left hand pointing down towards the earth. You do have some of the red roses and the white lilies, and you have the cup, the pentacle, the wand, and the sword. And again, in the Hanson-Roberts, you have most all of that same imagery, which can really help you when you're studying. So these are still pretty close. However, on the light purple background, looking at the Gaian and the Chrysalis deck, you can see the images are totally changed, although there are a few similarities. So the similarities retained in the Magician on these two, you do have symbols for fire, water, earth, and air. though less explicitly stated for the Minor Arcana here. But you have quite a different image. You have a drummer, his hands are in a drumming position. Okay, and in the Chrysalis deck, you don't even have a person, you have crows and some very complex images that are very, very different. Now, for the remaining Major Arcana, I'm going to kind of quickly scroll through, but I'd like you to take a look at these and see how the images differ. So, the High Priestess for the Rider-Waite-Smith and clone. For very similar decks, the Llewellyn Classic and the Hanson-Roberts. And for the big departures, again, the decks that depart a great deal may rename them. So in this case, instead of being the High Priestess, the Gaian calls it card number 2, the Priestess. And although the Chrysalis deck subtitles this the High Priestess, basically this card is called Sorceress. Card 3, the Empress. Rider-Waite-Smith and its clone, the Radiant Rider-Waite-Smith. And for me, the Radiant Rider-Waite-Smith with fewer lines, I find it actually easier for me to catch the images, but this is a matter of personal preference. You may prefer the original Rider-Waite-Smith. In the two similar decks, there are some significant changes in the images, but still most all of the symbolism is still there, the key symbols. However, in the Gaian and the Chrysalis, just examples of two decks that are quite a bit different. The name is changed to the Gardener and Gaia. The Emperor, Rider-Waite-Smith and Radiant Rider-Waite-Smith. The similar decks, and the significant departures. For the Hierophant, the Rider-Waite-Smiths and clone. The closely similar decks that retain most all of the key images and symbols. And the significantly different decks. In this case, named the Teacher and the Divine Child. For the Lovers, this is how the Lovers is depicted in the Rider-Waite-Smith. Similar decks. Again, in this case, the Hanson-Roberts diverges quite a bit. And these are really significant departures in the Gaian and the Chrysalis. Card number 7, the Chariot, is full of a lot of relatively complex imagery. In the similar decks, such as the Llewellyn Classic and the Hanson-Roberts, a lot of the images are the same. The symbols are by and large the same, though there are some departures. However, in the Gaian and the Chrysalis, for example, the images are entirely different. There is a logical connection between these images and the original Chariot, but at first glance, if you're not familiar with the Chariot in the more traditional decks, it can really be hard to make that leap. Strengths. This is how strength is depicted in the Rider-Waite-Smith and in similar decks that retain most of the same imagery. And in decks that are more of a departure from the Rider-Waite-Smith, these are two ways that they were depicted. The Hermit, for card number 9, this is how it's depicted in the Rider-Waite-Smith. In similar decks, most all of the key symbols are still there in the decks, though they look a good bit different. And in 2 decks that depart a great deal from the Rider-Waite-Smith. Card number 10, the Wheel of Fortune, is very, very full of symbolism that's not necessarily intuitive. This card, I found, for me at least, took quite a bit of study, quite a bit of reading to try to start to understand some of the symbolism. And it was kind of helpful that a lot of the key concepts were retained on these relatively similar decks. And in the relatively similar decks, I could still use different guidebooks to give me a better idea. And I could look at these cards and say, okay, yeah, I see that symbol, and okay, I think I understand. But some decks are going to depart so much and be so rich in symbolism that may be specific only to that deck that it might be hard to understand other descriptions. Card 11, which in the Rider-Waite-Smith is Justice. In the Thoth deck and the Thoth tradition, card and some of the older card traditions too, going back to the Tarot de Marseille, card number 8, Strength, and card number 11, Justice, are switched. And that was done for some reasons related to astrological associations, but it isn't something that you really need to worry about when you are starting out learning. So this is Justice in the Rider-Waite-Smith and clone. And most of the symbols are retained in these 2 closely similar decks, although the images are different. These are examples of decks that depart quite a lot and relate, for example, with the chrysalis to the Egyptian figure of Ma'at. And again, ones that depart quite a bit may take a good bit more study and more knowledge about different cultural traditions. Card number 12, the Hanged Man. So we can see it in the Radiant Rider-Waite-Smith as well as the original. The similar decks do keep most of the image symbols, but even small changes can sometimes make a difference. For example, in the Rider-Waite-Smith and the Hanson-Roberts, the legs are crossed this direction. In this similar one, they're crossed in the opposite direction. And again, some interpretations interpret the way the legs are crossed as being significant. So there are differences if you're not using the Rider-Waite-Smith deck. These decks interpret the concepts related to the Hanged Man very, very differently. And you can see some similarities in the original image, but kind of different. And for example, in the chrysalis, an entirely different image, which may be conceptually related, but would take a little bit more work to make the associations. This is Death in the Rider-Waite-Smith and similar. In closely similar imagery in the Hanson-Roberts and the Llewellyn Classic. But looking at a very, very different take on it in these other decks, for example, looking at it without the skeletal skeletal figure of the Grim Reaper, but quite a different image here in the Gaian deck, and related to Ariadne, a different cultural myth for death. Temperance, again, is a card that's not always easy to understand at first glance and is very rich in symbolism in the Rider-Waite-Smith deck. And some similar decks keep a lot of the key symbolisms, but there are also decks that have significant departures from it. The Devil, this is how it's represented in the Rider-Waite-Smith and similar, and clones actually. And these images in similar decks retain a lot of the same key symbols, whereas there are other decks that depart hugely from the original symbolism, although they may keep some of the key concepts that once you've explored the Rider-Waite-Smith, then sometimes the departures make more sense. 16, the Tower. This is how it looks in the Radiant Rider-Waite-Smith and the Rider-Waite-Smith, and fairly similar in these two decks as well. However, it's again represented quite differently in some other decks. You'll find a number of decks identify the tower instead as lightning, and there are often figures of large trees being struck by lightning. This is used in a number of different decks. And then the chrysalis, again, is hearkening to cultural mythology from a different culture. 17, the Star. It's another card which has a lot of significant symbolic images in it. And similar decks may lose some of those key images, and more divergent decks may hearken to very, very different cultural traditions or very different images and abandon a lot of Rider-Waite-Smith's traditional symbols. Similar to that is the moon in the Rider-Waite-Smith in some fairly similar traditions, whereas other decks may depart and use quite different symbols and images. 19 for the sun. This is what it looks like in the Rider-Waite-Smith deck. And a lot of the key ideas repeated in these very similar decks, Llewellyn Classic and Hanson-Roberts. And some of the images is retained, for example, in the Gaian deck, but in some other decks that depart a great deal, the image can look quite different. Not 19, 20, Judgment. Looks like this in the Rider-Waite-Smith deck. Some people have issues with the spelling, whether judgment has an E or not, which is a British-American difference. The Llewellyn Classic and the Hanson-Roberts retain a lot of the traditional imagery. However, many decks which depart more have a very different take on the concept and may go in different directions with different cultural traditions, different religious traditions, different images. And finally, the last card in the Rider-Waite-Smith tradition is called The World. Again, it's full of a lot of images, a lot of symbols that are also connected to card number 10, the Wheel of Fortune. And you can see a lot of similarity in the images in these two decks, the Llewellyn Classic and Hanson Roberts, but they may look very different in other decks, such as the Gaian and the Chrysalis. Okay, that's been a lightning tour through the 22 cards of the Major Arcana in different decks. One major conclusion: unique thematic decks, which are significant departures from the Rider-Waite-Smith. So that purple group, what we looked at last in each one of the cards, that unusual or highly specific thematic deck may be appealing to you, and it may be a great deck later, but it might have too high of a learning curve to start out with. That's what happened with me when I gave up several times when I tried to start learning about tarot. So I recommend you choose a good learning deck. Coming back to the question, how do I choose a good tarot deck to start out with if I'm new to all of this? My recommendation: using a Rider-Waite-Smith deck, a Rider-Waite-Smith clone, or closely similar decks. It makes it much easier to learn the core meaning of each card. After becoming familiar with each card in the Rider-Waite-Smith type deck, exploring more diverse decks becomes more enriching and fun. So today, I've talked a little bit about my false starts, features of a good learning deck, the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, the Major Arcana in 6 different decks, variation and departures, and I finished off with my recommendation of how to choose a good learning deck for you. I hope this information on choosing a good tarot deck, especially if you're new to tarot, has been helpful to you. And I hope that you will join me again for Tarot Fascination. Thank you very much.